Okay, we have looked already in quite a bit of depth at the origins and development of the discipline of biblical theology. We now, for the next bit, want to turn our attention to the discipline of historical theology. So, by way of definition, historical theology as a discipline investigates the progressive realization of Christianity and the truth of divine revelation in the lives, heart, and worship and thought of humanity. As with biblical theology, its task is descriptive in that it deals with the past as the past and answers the question, what and why did previous generations understand and teach what they did with reference to the Christian faith? So, let's move on here. The nature of historical theology / history of doctrine. The study of the history of doctrines shares a recent beginning with the related fields of Old and New Testament theology. All three trace their beginnings to the late 17th century and the rise of modern historiography and historical consciousness. Johann S. Semler, the German church historian and biblical critic, demonstrated in 1762 that the history of doctrine should be separated from church history or ecclesiastical history. Tholuck, the great mediating German theologian, called Semler the father of the history of doctrines. Whereas before Semler, doctrines had been perceived as static by both Protestants and Catholics, he proposed that history was only a moving, steadily changing element. He says, quote, "The essence of dogma is only restless change." History, for Semler, is governed by the arbitrary powers of subjectivity. His work represents the first critical examination of primitive Christianity and the development of dogma. It is based upon the presupposition that Christianity can be regarded only as an historical phenomenon to be studied historically and without dogmatic presuppositions, and its historical manifestation must be analyzed in the context of its historical milieu. It was particularly during the 19th century, with the rise of the Romantic movement and Hegelian philosophy, that history and theological thought were envisioned as dynamic. Entwicklung, development, that's the German term for development, became the watchword of the 19th century German mindset. This idea has continued to exercise influence over all theological study since that time. Prior to this time, both Roman Catholic and Protestant theologians viewed their theological systems as static, as if they had emerged directly from the New Testament. Even as in Greek mythology, Minerva was seen to have emerged from the head of Zeus, fully grown and armed for battle. For example, in America, at the 50th anniversary of Charles Hodge's tenure as a Princeton faculty member, Hodge boasted that a new idea had never arisen at Princeton. The view of life and thought espoused by that institution, Princeton Seminary, was one of continuity and the static nature of reality. This view was not confined to Princeton, however. It also represented a large segment of conservative American Christianity. Particularly influential in popularizing the concept of the development of doctrine was the Roman Catholic Cardinal John Henry Newman. Historical theology is a hybrid discipline, partaking in part from theology and in part from history. This hybrid recognizes both historical and sociological forces involved in the way questions were asked and answers were given. But it does not subsume the answers under sociological categories. Rather, while recognizing the contingent factors involved, historical theology is vitally concerned with the content of the beliefs put forward as intrinsically Christian. The ideal historian of Christian theology would be grounded deep in the truth of the gospel and in Christian churchmanship, equally at home in the fields of history and philosophy, and endowed with powerful gifts of expression. This is from one of the premier historians of theology. He continues, the historian of Christian theology should be aware of the cultural context of the theologians and their presuppositions which he is investigating and recording. All theology is formulated in a cultural background. Cultural factors have influenced the theology of theologians of the past in ways in which the theologians themselves have not always been aware. So let's look for a moment at the development of historical theology. William Muncher was a disciple of Semler and the theologian of the Enlightenment. He has been called the father of modern history of dogma. As with biblical theology, the task of the discipline of historical theology is descriptive. It is not critical. The Church has given its faith a fixed form in dogma. However, at least from the Protestant perspective, the fallibility of dogma must be recognized as axiomatic. The dogma of the Church, as well as the doctrines propounded by various scholars and teachers, must be subjected to the final authority of Scripture. Quoting here, to prove the harmony or disharmony of dogma or doctrine with these courts of appeal is not the office of history of doctrine, but rather that of dogmatics and practical theology. The history of doctrines can only be required to present the arguments which have been adduced by the original advocates of a given dogma. History is not historical criticism. Additionally, we must realize that there is no divine dogma. Dogma/doctrine is the human response in faith to divine revelation. As a human response, there is ever the possibility of admixture with error. Upon this principle, it may be possible for one to recognize the Christian and biblical character of the ideas maintained in the biblical creeds of Nicaea and Chalcedon, while being unable to approve of all the terminology employed by them. Another name prominent in the development of the discipline is that of Ferdinand Christian Bauer. You may remember we saw Bauer with reference to the development of New Testament theology. That is what he is best remembered for. But he also was a scholar of the history of doctrine and produced a 5-volume history of dogma. In this work, Bauer regarded the task of the history of dogma as twofold. One, to discern the facts in their actual settings as ascertained through credible witnesses, and two, to interpret these facts in their inner unfolding. As with his work in New Testament criticism, Bauer applied the Hegelian dialectic to the progress of the data. But the idea of development grew beyond its Hegelian roots. The mediating theologians, Neander and Hagenbach, both attempt to demonstrate development in their works. The greatest historian of dogma, or doctrine, was Adolf von Harnack. He died in 1932. His history of dogma still stands as the giant in the field of the history of doctrine. It was he who introduced the idea that dogma originated with the infusion of Hellenism into the early church. The field of history of doctrine has been dominated, not surprisingly, by German scholarship. By the way, Harnack's History of Dogma is still in print. It has been condensed, not content-wise, but down to 4 volumes. But that is the classic History of Dogma. Tremendous resource. You just need to be aware of the presuppositions, the liberal presuppositions that Harnack is operating from. So, how should we think of the discipline? Should we think of history of dogma or history of doctrine? Well, while the terms dogma and doctrine are often used interchangeably, in the strictest sense, they are not synonymous. The term dogma itself is derived from the Greek verb dokeo, which we translate as it seems. Even within the New Testament itself, the term became attached to the findings of an ecclesiastical body. Luke uses this term in Acts 16:4 as the term dogmata of the findings of the Jerusalem Council. Reinhold Seeberg, in his History of Christian Doctrines, states, "The theological term dogma designates either an ecclesiastical doctrine or the entire structure of such doctrines, that is, the doctrinal system of the church. As dogma, the formal expression of the truth held by the church at large, or by a particular church, the church expects the acknowledgement of it by her members and of her recognized teachers. We apply the term dogma only to such propositions as have attained ecclesiastical character. Although the form of dogma is the work of theology, its content is derived from the common faith of the church." Otto Heik has likewise observed, and I quote, "The name dogma is applied to the crystallized statements of the church." Using the technical sense of the term, dogma refers to the study of creedal and confessional statements. It is the study of the gradual development of the theological thought from its beginnings in the immediate post-apostolic age, the Apostolic Fathers, until its final creedal formulation. Most recognize that there is a fundamental core of dogmatic statements that are recognized by all Christian traditions. This core of statements arises out of the first four ecumenical councils of the Church, beginning at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325 and running through the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451. By tradition, the Apostles' Creed and the Athanasian Creed are also highly revered, but these two creeds have never had the formal imprimatur of the ancient church's doctrinal consensus. Beyond these basic creeds, different communions trace their creedal commitments in a sectarian fashion, with final formulation varying according to the particular communion. For example, at this point in history, the final formulation of Catholic dogma is given in the results of the Second Vatican Council. The final formulation of the Lutherans is the Lutheran Formula of Concord. The final formulation of Eastern Orthodox doctrine is the Second Council of Nicaea. And within the Reformed community, there has been only one universal Reformed consensus, and that was the Synod of the Council of Dort in 1618. Among the Eastern Orthodox, dogmatics culminate with the Second Council of Nicaea in AD 787. Orthodox theology has admitted no further development or clarification since that time. Of all the Christian communions, its theology is the most ancient in the sense that it preserves unchanged the theology and liturgy of the ancient church. Unlike Orthodoxy, Roman Catholic dogmatics continues to develop throughout the centuries, and while its most recent statement is embodied in the pronouncements of Vatican II, which met from 1963 to 1965, this development of doctrine within Catholicism is an ongoing process and has not, in principle, been halted. Within Lutheranism, dogmatics ends with the Formula of Concord in 1580. Since that time, there has been much theological discussion, but there have been no alterations of its creed. Reformed dogmatics find their classic expression in the findings of the Synod of Dort in 1519. It is from the Synod of Dort we get the idea of the 5 points of Calvinism. The Synod of Dort was called to answer the remonstrance put forth by the growing Arminian party in the Netherlands. The synod was the only international synod of Reformed churches worldwide. There were representatives from Scotland, from England, from the Netherlands, from France, from Switzerland. The English-speaking churches in the Reformed tradition looked to the Westminster Confession of 1649 as authoritative, as well as holding other confessions, such as the Second Helvetic Confession, in high regard. But in the strictest sense, these latter two documents ought not to be regarded as dogmatic statements, since they are not formally recognized by the entire Reformed tradition. Jaroslav Pelikan, the recently deceased great historian of doctrine, has observed, "A doctrine once formulated does not stop developing and become fixed. Not even the dogma of the Trinity has stood perfectly still since its adoption and clarification. Since this is so, we must look beyond dogmatic formulations in our study and examine not just the creedal statements, but also the doctrinal formulations that have developed since the creedal pronouncements." Now, Pelikan died just last year in 2007, and he, late in his life, his magnum opus was a 5-volume Christian tradition. Pelikan, for most of his life, was a Lutheran, but in the last decade of his life he converted to Eastern Orthodoxy because he said that was where his heart really was. Pelikan was a conservative and a tremendous intellect, tremendous theologian, and a very godly individual. And his work as the work of a conservative has really surpassed the work of Harnack, which had stood for almost 100 years before that time. In contrast to dogma, the term doctrine, the Greek term here is didaskalia, and we see it, for example, in 1 Timothy 4:16. Didaskalia is almost universally translated teaching in the New Testament. Doctrine is a broader term than dogma. It has the idea of that which is taught, what is held, what is put forth as true or supported by a teacher, a school, or the thought of a group. In this sense, doctrine denotes teaching as distinguished from dogma, which denotes only such teaching as is part of the confession of the church. Doctrine, or doctrines, are much more diverse, are usually more detailed than dogmatic statements. A very visible example of the difference between the two terms, dogma and doctrine, is that in the confessional churches, and here we would look at the Reformed, the Lutheran, the Roman Catholic, these churches have dogmas. Baptists, independent churches, the free church tradition, generally do not recognize dogmas, but they assert doctrines. Many in the non-liturgical tradition will not formally recognize the authority of the ancient creeds. And by this we mean those first 4 creeds that come out of the councils from Nicaea to Constantinople. Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, while they do affirm the theology which is contained in the creeds. Instead, what they formally do is only recognize the Bible as authoritative. This is the non-liturgical traditions